Imagine stepping onto an abandoned Texas airfield, the kind of place where the silence screams and the shadows dance. But tonight, there's more than just the echoes of forgotten planes. We stumbled upon a bizarre set of rules, etched into the very fabric of this desolate land. Rules that make absolutely no sense until they do. The assignment seemed straightforward enough when my supervisor, Detective Rivera, handed me the overnight security detail. Blackwood Airfield had been abandoned for nearly 3 decades, but recent reports of trespassers and vandalism meant someone needed to keep watch. What he didn't mention was the 47-mile drive through increasingly desolate Texas countryside, where civilization gradually peeled away like old paint until nothing remained but endless stretches of scrubland and the occasional oil derrick stabbing at the darkening sky. My partner for this assignment was Officer Elena Vasquez, a veteran with 20 years on the force and a reputation for handling the weird cases nobody else wanted. As we turned off the main highway onto a cracked asphalt road that seemed to lead into absolute nothingness, she glanced at the GPS with obvious skepticism. The device had been losing signal for the past 10 miles, and now showed nothing but a blank gray screen. The sun hung low on the horizon like a dying ember, casting everything in shades of amber and rust. Mesquite trees dotted the landscape like arthritic fingers, their shadows stretching impossibly long across the barren ground. The air conditioning in our patrol car wheezed against the oppressive heat that still radiated from the earth, even as evening approached. Through the windshield, heat waves created phantom lakes that disappeared as we drew closer, leaving only more cracked earth and withered grass. Elena broke the silence first. 30 years abandoned, and suddenly people are interested in this place again. She consulted the folder Rivera had given us, squinting at the photocopied pages in the fading light. Says here the last recorded flight was in 1994. Cargo plane that never made it to its destination. The road narrowed further, forcing us to slow as potholes appeared with increasing frequency. Our headlights began to cut through the gathering dusk, illuminating weathered fence posts that seemed to march alongside us like silent sentinels. In the distance, the skeletal outlines of structures began to emerge from the gloom. Hangar buildings, their metal siding peeling and scarred by decades of wind and sand. A control tower that leaned at an unnatural angle, its windows dark and empty as dead eyes. As we approached the main gate, the first truly unsettling detail became apparent. The chain-link fencing was topped not with the typical razor wire you'd expect at an abandoned facility, but with something that looked almost decorative. Thin metal spirals that caught the last rays of sunlight and threw them back in scattered, prismatic flashes. Elena pulled the car to a stop and stepped out to examine the gate more closely. "That's strange," she called back to me, her voice carrying an odd echo in the still air. "The lock's been cut recently, fresh metal shavings on the ground." She lifted the heavy padlock, its severed links gleaming silver against the rust-stained chain. "Someone's been here, and not that long ago." The gate swung open with a prolonged screech that seemed to announce our arrival to the empty airfield beyond. Elena climbed back into the car, but as we pulled through the opening, I heard the distinct sound of the gate swinging shut behind us. The mechanical clang of metal against metal carried a finality that made something in my chest tighten. In the rearview mirror, I watched as the gate settled into place with an almost deliberate precision. Our headlights swept across the main runway as we drove deeper into the facility. The asphalt was cracked and buckled, with weeds pushing through and determined green patches that looked black in the darkness. On either side, the hulking forms of abandoned aircraft sat like sleeping giants, their wings drooping with fatigue, their cockpit windows reflecting our lights with an almost organic gleam. The control tower loomed ahead of us, and as our lights played across its base, I noticed something that made me pump the brakes. Graffiti covered the lower portion of the structure, But this wasn't the usual teenage vandalism you'd expect. Instead, neat block letters had been spray painted in white across the weathered concrete, forming what appeared to be a list. Elena was already out of the car before I'd fully stopped, her flashlight beam dancing across the strange text. "Jake, you need to see this," she called, her voice tight with something I couldn't quite identify. I joined her at the base of the tower, my own flashlight adding to the illumination. The words were clearly visible now, arranged in a vertical list with almost military precision. Rule 1. Never look up after midnight. Rule 2. If the hangar lights flicker, count to 10 before moving. Rule 3. Do not respond to your name being called from the runway. Rule 4. The fuel truck driver is not your friend. Rule 5. Leave before sunrise or become part of the morning shift. Below the list, in smaller but equally neat letters, was a final line that made the hair on my arm stand up. These rules keep you alive. Follow them. Elena's flashlight beam wavered slightly as she read the words aloud. What kind of prank is this supposed to be? But her voice lacked conviction, and I could see the way her free hand had unconsciously moved to rest on her service weapon. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it a sound that might have been metal creaking in the breeze, or might have been something else entirely. In the distance, one of the hangar buildings seemed to shift slightly, as if settling into a more comfortable position. The abandoned aircraft around us stood silent and still, but there was something about their positioning that suggested watchfulness, as if they were aware of our presence and waiting to see what we would do next. I checked my watch. 9:47 p.m. We had committed to staying until dawn, as per our orders. The nearest backup was over an hour away, assuming our radio would even reach that far from this isolated location. As if responding to my thoughts, Elena tried her radio, only to receive nothing but static in return. "Looks like we're on our own," she said, but there was a forced casualness to her tone that didn't fool either of us. The rules on the wall seemed to watch us with invisible eyes, waiting to see if we were foolish enough to ignore their warnings. The airfield stretched out before us in all directions, a maze of runways, buildings, and shadows that seemed to shift and breathe in the darkness. Somewhere in that maze, we would need to patrol until morning. Somewhere in that maze, the rules would be put to the test. And as the last traces of twilight faded from the western sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. The patrol car's engine ticked as it cooled in the desert night, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence that had settled over Blackwood Airfield like a burial shroud. Elena and I stood before the graffitied rules, our flashlight beams creating pools of harsh white light against the concrete. The words seemed to pulse with their own malevolent energy, and I found myself reading them again and again, as if repetition might reveal some hidden logic. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," Elena said, pulling out a notebook. Her years of experience had taught her to document everything, no matter how bizarre. "Let's start with the basics. What do you know about this place?" I consulted a case file, though the information was frustratingly sparse. Blackwood Airfield was built in 1962 as a private cargo hub, mostly handled overnight freight runs between Houston and El Paso. The owner was a man named Vincent Blackwood, made his fortune in oil before branching into aviation. I flipped through the yellowed pages, squinting in the flashlight beam. Says here the operation was profitable for nearly 30 years, right up until 1994. What happened in 94? The file's account was clinical in its brevity, but somehow that made it more unsettling. 3 separate incidents in the span of 2 months. First was a cargo plane that took off from here bound for Phoenix and simply vanished from radar 20 minutes into the flight. No wreckage ever found, no distress call, nothing. Then 2 weeks later, one of the fuel truck drivers was found dead in Hangar 3. Heart attack, according to the coroner, but he was only 36 years old and in perfect health. Elena's pen scratched against paper as she took notes. And the third incident. I turned the page, finding a police report that was heavily redacted. Most of the details had been blacked out, but the conclusion was clear enough. Vincent Blackwood himself, found dead in the control tower after missing for 3 days. Official cause of death was listed as exposure, but there are notes here suggesting the investigating officers had concerns about the circumstances. The wind gusted across the airfield, carrying with it a scent that was equal parts aviation fuel and something else, something organic and unpleasant. In the distance, a piece of loose metal banged against one of the hangars with irregular, almost rhythmic impacts. Elena gestured toward the nearest building, a maintenance hangar whose doors gaped open like a massive mouth. Let's take a look around, see if we can find anything that explains these rules. As we approached the hangar, our footsteps echoed off the concrete in strange ways, as if the sound was being stretched and distorted by the vast, empty spaces. The building's interior was cavernous, filled with the ghostly outlines of abandoned equipment. Tool benches lined the walls, their surfaces still holding the precise arrangements of wrenches and screwdrivers that had been left behind 3 decades ago. It was as if the workers had simply vanished mid-task, expecting to return the next morning. Elena's flashlight beam swept across a workbench near the far wall, revealing something that made us both stop in our tracks. Tacked to a corkboard above the bench was a collection of handwritten notes, their edges yellowed with age, but their messages still legible. Unlike the spray-painted rules on the control tower, these appeared to be personal observations, written in different hands and at different times. Day 127. The fuel truck moved again last night. Found it parked next to Hangar 2, but Martinez swears he left it by the office. Engine was still warm at 6 a.m. Elena read aloud from the first note. Day 145. Tommy heard someone calling his name from the main runway. Went to investigate and came back 3 hours later with no memory of where he'd been. Found him standing by the fence, staring at nothing. I directed my light to another note, this one written in shakier handwriting. The midnight shift is getting harder. Something in the sky moves wrong after 12. Don't look up. Don't acknowledge it. Just keep working. Blackwood says we need the overtime pay, but I don't think any amount of money is worth this. The final note was the most disturbing, written in what appeared to be the same hand as the spray-painted rules. It was brief, but chilling. They took Henderson last week. Found his uniform folded neat on his workbench, but Henderson was gone. Boss says he quit, but we all know better. The morning shift is getting bigger, and none of us remember their names. Elena lowered her flashlight, and for a moment we stood in the thick darkness of the hangar. Jake, what if those rules aren't graffiti? What if they're warnings left by people who used to work here? Before I could respond, a sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the airfield. It was mechanical, rhythmic, like the sound of an engine turning over but failing to catch. The noise came in bursts, each attempt lasting exactly 7 seconds before cutting off, followed by a 10-second silence, then starting again. We moved toward the hangar's open doors, peering out into the night. The sound was coming from the direction of the main runway, where a cluster of buildings sat like hunched figures against the starlit sky. Among them, barely visible in the darkness, was what appeared to be a fuel truck parked beside a structure I assumed was Hangar 2. That wasn't there when we drove in, Elena whispered. I checked my watch, 11:23 p.m., still 37 minutes before midnight, before the first rule would potentially come into play. But the fuel truck sat there like a patient predator, its chrome bumper catching occasional glints of starlight. The rhythmic engine sound continued, and as we listened, I began to notice something else. Between the mechanical noises, carried on the desert wind, came what sounded almost like voices, not clear enough to make out words, but with the unmistakable cadence of human conversation. Multiple voices, speaking in low, urgent tones. Elena started walking toward the sound, but I grabbed her arm. Wait, Rule 4. The fuel truck driver is not your friend. She paused, considering. You think we should take these seriously? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Every rational part of my mind insisted that we were dealing with elaborate pranks, that the abandoned airfield was playing tricks on our senses in a way that isolated places often do. But there was something about the precision of those warnings, the clinical nature of the handwritten notes we'd found, that suggested a different truth. The engine's sound stopped suddenly, leaving only the whisper of wind across empty runways. In the silence that followed, I could have sworn I heard footsteps on concrete, moving with purposeful direction toward our position. Elena drew her weapon, not pointing it at anything specific, but holding it ready. Whoever's out there, this is police. Identify yourself. The footsteps stopped. For long minutes, we waited in the doorway of the hangar, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The fuel truck remained motionless beside Hangar 2, but there was something about its positioning that seemed different now, as if it had shifted slightly during the moments when our attention was elsewhere. 11:47, Elena whispered, checking her watch. 13 minutes until midnight. 13 minutes until we would discover whether the first rule was merely the product of disturbed minds or something far more dangerous. As if in response to the approaching deadline, the airfield around us seemed to grow more oppressive, the shadows deeper, the silence more complete. In the distance, barely audible above the wind, came the sound of someone whistling, a cheerful, work song melody that drifted across the empty runways like smoke, impossible to pinpoint but unmistakably present. The whistling was moving closer. The whistling grew closer, a jaunty tune that seemed grotesquely out of place in the desolate airfield. Elena and I pressed ourselves against the inner wall of the hangar, weapons drawn, hearts hammering against our ribs. The melody was old-fashioned, something you might hear a maintenance worker humming during a routine shift, but there was something fundamentally wrong about its timing and placement. My watch read 11:52 p.m., 8 minutes until midnight. Through the hangar's open doorway, a figure emerged from the shadows near the fuel truck. In the starlight, I could make out the silhouette of a man in coveralls, walking with the casual gait of someone completely at home in this place. He carried what appeared to be a clipboard and was whistling that same cheerful tune as he moved between the abandoned aircraft, occasionally stopping to make notes. Elena raised her weapon. Police, stop and identify yourself. The figure paused, turning in our direction. For a moment, he seemed to consider our presence, head tilted at an angle that suggested curiosity rather than alarm. Then, impossibly, he waved, a friendly, almost welcoming gesture that sent ice water through my veins. Evening, officers, came a voice from the darkness, pleasant and conversational. Welcome to the night shift. Beautiful evening for a patrol, don't you think? The man resumed his walking, moving with unhurried purpose toward Hangar 3. His whistling picked up again, but now I could see that his lips weren't moving. The sound seemed to emanate from somewhere else entirely, as if the airfield itself was producing the melody. Sir, I need you to stop and show me some identification, Elena called out, but her voice carried less authority than before. Something about the figure's casual dismissal of two armed police officers suggested that normal rules didn't apply here. 11:56 p.m. The whistling stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear Elena's breathing beside me, quick and shallow. The figure had disappeared behind Hangar 3, but the feeling of being watched remained, stronger than ever. We need to get to higher ground, I whispered. The control tower. We could see the whole airfield from there and maintain radio contact. Elena nodded, but as we prepared to leave the hangar, she grabbed my arm. Jake, what if he's right? What if he really is just a night shift worker who never got the memo that this place was abandoned? The question revealed the insidious nature of our situation. How do you distinguish between the supernatural and the merely unusual. Between genuine threat and elaborate hoax, the rules on the wall offered no guidance, only warnings whose logic remained opaque. We made our way across the open ground toward the control tower, moving quickly but quietly. The building loomed above us, its broken windows like vacant eye sockets. The metal stairs leading to the upper level creaked under our weight, each step announcing our presence to whatever else might be sharing the night with us. The control room was a capsule of preserved time. Dust-covered equipment lined the walls, toggle switches and dials frozen in their final positions. Through the panoramic windows, the entire airfield spread out below us like a map of desolation. From this vantage point, I could see details that had been hidden at ground level. The fuel truck was gone. Elena pointed toward Hangar 2, where the vehicle had been parked just minutes before. It was right there. I'm certain of it. I checked my watch. 11:59 p.m. 30 seconds until midnight. 30 seconds until we discovered whether Rule 1 was superstition or survival instruction. As if the universe was responding to some cosmic cue, the first change began exactly at 11 hours, 59 minutes, and 45 seconds. The lights came on. Not electric lights. The power to Blackwood Airfield had been cut decades ago. Instead, a soft phosphorescent glow began to emanate from the runway markers, the hangar entrances, and the abandoned aircraft themselves. It was subtle at first, like moonlight reflecting off metal surfaces, but it grew steadily brighter as the seconds ticked toward midnight. My watch face showed 12 hours. Elena grabbed my shoulder. "Don't look up," she hissed, remembering Rule 1, just as I felt the overwhelming compulsion to raise my eyes toward the night sky. The urge was almost irresistible. Something above us was moving, casting shadows that shifted and danced across the control room floor. The sound was like fabric rustling, or perhaps wings beating with impossible size and rhythm. Whatever it was vast enough to block out sections of the star field, creating zones of absolute darkness that moved with predatory intent. I forced myself to stare at the floor, and my hands, at anything except the ceiling or the windows that revealed the sky above. Beside me, Elena was doing the same, her knuckles white as she gripped her weapon. The shadow passed overhead multiple times, each transit accompanied by that rustling sound and a subtle change in air pressure that made my ears pop. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the presence above us moved on. The phosphorescent glow from the runway began to fade, and normal darkness returned to the airfield. But we had crossed a threshold, and there was no pretending anymore that the rules were mere graffiti. The radio crackled to life suddenly, startling us both. Through the static came a voice, distant but clear. "Control tower, this is ground crew. We're ready to begin fueling operations on runway 2. Please confirm wind direction and visibility." Elena keyed the microphone. "This is police patrol. Identify yourself and state your current location." Silence. Then, "Police? That's not protocol. Where's the regular night supervisor? We have a schedule to maintain." The voice was professional, matter of fact, completely unconcerned by the presence of law enforcement. In the distance, I could see lights moving near the runway, as if ground vehicles were positioning themselves for some kind of operation. "Sir, this facility has been abandoned since 1994. You need to explain your presence here immediately." Laughter came through the radio, not mocking, but genuinely amused. "Abandoned? Friend, we've been working this shift for 30 years. Same routine every night. Some things don't change just because the calendar does." 12:17 a.m. Elena tried the radio again, but received only static. The moving lights below had disappeared, leaving the airfield as dark and empty as before. But the normalcy felt forced now, artificial, like a stage set that had been quickly rearranged between scenes. A new sound began to echo across the empty runways. the unmistakable roar of aircraft engines warming up for takeoff. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, building in intensity until the control tower windows vibrated in their frames. But there were no aircraft on the active runway, no navigation lights cutting through the darkness. The engines reached peak power, and I could hear the characteristic whine of a heavy cargo plane beginning its takeoff roll. The Phantom aircraft seemed to pass directly below us, and for a moment the control tower shook as if buffeted by jet wash. Then, impossibly, the sound began to climb, rising into the night sky as the invisible plane gained altitude. Elena was staring at me with wide eyes. "Jake, did we just witness a ghost flight?" Before I could answer, my name echoed across the airfield, not from the radio, but from outside, carried on the night wind. "Jake, Jake, over here." The voice was calling from the direction of the main runway, urgent and familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. Elena saw me start toward the window and grabbed my arm. "Rule 3, she reminded me. Do not respond to your name being called from the runway. But the voice continued, more insistent now. "Jake, I need help. Something's wrong with the fuel truck." It sounded like someone I knew, someone I should help, and every instinct screamed at me to respond. I forced myself to stay put, but the effort required all my willpower. The voice called several more times before fading away, leaving only the whisper of wind through broken windows and the distant creak of settling metal. We had survived the first 3 rules, but the night was far from over, and somewhere in the darkness below, I could see the fuel truck parked beside Hangar 3, its engine running despite the absence of any driver. The morning shift was still hours away, and I was beginning to understand that dawn might not bring the salvation we hoped for. The fuel truck sat idling beside Hangar 3 like a patient beast, its exhaust creating ghostly wisps in the cold desert air. From our vantage point in the control tower, Elena and I watched the vehicle with growing unease. Every few minutes, it would move slightly, just a few feet forward or backward, but always returning to the same general position. The movement was subtle enough that we might have dismissed it as tricks of light and shadow, except for one crucial detail. There was nobody in the driver's seat. "We need to get closer," Elena said, but her voice lacked conviction. The radio had been silent for over an hour, and our cell phones showed no signal. We were isolated in a bubble of strangeness, cut off from the rational world beyond the airfield's boundaries. 1:34 a.m. I consulted the rules we'd photographed on our phones. Rule 2 had been gnawing at me. If the hangar lights flicker, count to 10 before moving. As if summoned by my attention, a faint glow began to emanate from Hangar 1, the largest of the buildings. The light pulsed irregularly, like a dying fluorescent bulb struggling to maintain illumination. "Count," Elena whispered, and we began in unison. 1, 2, 3. The flickering grew more intense, casting wild shadows across the airfield. In those strobing moments of light, I caught glimpses of activity around the hangar, figures moving with purpose, equipment being wheeled into position, the organized chaos of a work crew preparing for some important task. 7, 8, 9, 10. The flickering stopped, plunging the hangar back into darkness. But in the sudden silence that followed, we could hear voices drifting across the night air. Not the phantom radio transmissions from earlier, but actual human conversation, muffled by distance but unmistakably real. Elena made the decision for both of us. We're police officers. Whatever's happening down there, it's our job to investigate. The descent from the control tower felt like entering another world. Each step down the metal stairs brought us closer to whatever force was orchestrating the night's events. The air grew thicker, laden with the scents of aviation fuel, oil, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that reminded me of meat left too long in the sun. As we approached Hangar 1, the voices became clearer, I could make out at least 3 distinct speakers, all male, discussing what sounded like routine maintenance issues. The conversation had the casual familiarity of coworkers who had known each other for years. Told you the hydraulic line was going to give us trouble. Need to get this bird ready for the morning run to Phoenix. Supervisor's not going to be happy if we fall behind schedule. Elena and I exchanged glances. Phoenix, the same destination as the cargo plane that had vanished in 1994. The same flight that had never reached its intended airport. We positioned ourselves beside the hangar's open doorway, weapons ready, listening to the work crew inside. The voices continued their technical discussion, occasionally punctuated by the sounds of tools against metal and the squeak of equipment being moved. It was so utterly normal that the normalcy itself became terrifying. Elena counted to 3 on her fingers. Then we both swung around the doorframe, flashlights and weapons raised. The hangar was empty. Our lights revealed nothing but the same abandoned equipment we'd seen earlier, covered in decades of dust and decay. No workers, no aircraft being serviced, no sign that anyone had been present for years. But the voices continued, coming from all around us, but with no visible source. Hey, did someone leave the lights on? Thought I heard something over by the door. Probably just the wind. I felt Elena's hand on my shoulder, pulling me back toward the entrance. The voices were getting louder, more agitated, as if our presence had been detected. But there was no one to detect us, nothing physical to account for the sounds. We retreated from the hangar, and the voices faded as we put distance between ourselves and the building. But the experience had shaken us both. Whatever forces were at work in Blackwood Airfield, they operated by rules that defied rational explanation. 2:47 a.m. The fuel truck had moved again, this time positioning itself directly on the main runway. Its headlights cut through the darkness like accusatory eyes, and I could see a figure in coveralls standing beside the driver's door. The same whistling tune from earlier drifted across the airfield, cheerful and persistent. That's him, Elena whispered. The man we saw before. The figure seemed to sense our observation. He turned toward the control tower, raised one hand in a casual wave, then climbed into the truck's cab. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle began moving down the runway, picking up speed as if preparing for takeoff. But fuel trucks don't fly. At the runway's end, where logic dictated the truck should either stop or crash, something impossible happened instead. The vehicle began to rise, its headlights tilting upward as it gained altitude. The sound of its engine Dopplered away into the night sky, leaving only the memory of impossibility and the faint scent of diesel exhaust. Elena was staring at the empty runway with an expression of profound disbelief. Jake, we just watched a fuel truck fly away. Before I could respond, the radio in the control tower crackled to life once again. This time, the voice was different, older, more authoritative, tinged with an accent I couldn't quite place. Ground Patrol, this is Vincent Blackwood. I need you to report to Hangar 5 immediately. We have a situation developing with the morning shift rotation. Vincent Blackwood, the owner who had died in this very control tower 30 years ago. Elena keyed the microphone with trembling fingers. Mr. Blackwood, this is Officer Vasquez. Sir, according to our records, you're deceased. Silence stretched across the airwaves, broken only by the hiss of static. Then, when the voice returned, it carried a note of tired amusement. Deceased. Yes, I suppose that's one way to put it. But death doesn't excuse us from our responsibilities, Officer Vasquez. The airfield must maintain its operations, regardless of such minor inconveniences. Now, I really do need you to check on Hangar 5. Some of the morning shift workers are getting restless. The transmission ended, leaving us alone with the implications of what we just heard. Hangar 5 sat at the far end of the complex, partially hidden behind a row of abandoned aircraft. From our current position, It was impossible to see if any activity was taking place there. 3:15 a.m. Elena holstered her weapon and headed for the stairs. "We have to see this through," she said, though her voice carried the weight of someone who knew she was making a potentially fatal mistake. As we made our way across the airfield toward Hangar 5, I noticed that the abandoned aircraft around us seemed more substantial than before, as if they were gradually becoming real again. Their metal surfaces gleamed with fresh paint. Their tires showed proper inflation. Their cockpit windows reflected our flashlight beams with the clarity of recently cleaned glass. The hangar's doors were closed, but warm yellow light seeped out around the edges, and we could hear the unmistakable sounds of human activity inside. Voices, footsteps, the clang of metal on metal. Unlike the phantom sounds from Hangar 1, these noises had weight and substance. Elena placed her hand on the door handle, then looked back at me one final time. "Rule 5, she said quietly. "Leave before sunrise or become part of the morning shift." The eastern horizon showed the first faint lightning that preceded dawn. We had perhaps an hour before sunrise, maybe less. Whatever we discovered in Hangar 5, we would need to process it quickly and make our escape before the night shift ended and something far worse began. The door handle turned easily under Elena's hand, and the warmth and light from within spilled out into the cold desert night. Inside, we could see figures moving with purposeful efficiency, preparing for what appeared to be the beginning of another workday. A workday that had been running continuously for 30 years, staffed by employees who had long since forgotten the difference between life and death, between reality and the eternal night shift that never ends. The interior of Hangar 5 was a snapshot of 1994 frozen in perpetual motion. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, dozens of workers in coveralls moved with the practiced efficiency of a crew that had been performing the same tasks for decades. They serviced aircraft that gleamed like new, checked clipboards with freshly printed schedules, and operated equipment that hummed with the vitality of regular use. None of them acknowledged our presence. Elena and I stood in the doorway, weapons lowered but ready, watching the impossible scene unfold before us. A supervisor in a white shirt and tie consulted a schedule board, making notes with a pencil that left actual marks on paper. Mechanics rolled tool carts between aircraft, their metal wheels leaving tracks and dust that shouldn't exist if the hangar had been abandoned for 30 years. "Morning briefing in 5 minutes," called the supervisor, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Phoenix run is scheduled for 0600. I want final checks completed on the cargo manifest by 0530. I checked my watch. 4:23 a.m. The eastern sky beyond the hangar's open rear doors showed the definite gray of approaching dawn. According to Rule 5, we had perhaps an hour to escape before becoming part of this eternal workforce. Elena started forward, but I caught her arm. One of the workers had paused in his tasks and was looking directly at us. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of face that suggested reliability and competence. But his eyes held something that made my blood freeze. A profound emptiness, as if whatever had once made him human had been carefully extracted, leaving only the shell of purpose and routine. "New arrivals," he announced to the supervisor, his voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. "They're not in uniform yet." The supervisor looked up from his clipboard, and I saw the same terrible emptiness in his gaze. "Ah, yes. The police officers. Vincent said you'd be joining us tonight." He set down his pencil with mechanical precision and walked toward us with steps that seemed too regular, too measured. "Welcome to the morning shift. We have uniforms in the supply room that should fit you both." "We're not staying," Elena said, backing toward the entrance. But as she moved, I realized with growing horror that the hangar's doors had closed behind us. The warm yellow light that had seemed so inviting now felt like a trap, and the sounds of normal work activity took on a sinister mechanical quality. like gears grinding in a machine designed to process human souls. The supervisor's smile never wavered, but there was nothing human in its geometry. "Oh, but you're staying. Everyone who works the night shift eventually joins the morning crew. It's simply a matter of timing." He gestured to the workers around us, and for the first time, I noticed the details that horror had initially hidden. Their movements were too precise, too repetitive. The mechanic checking the aircraft's landing gear performed the exact same sequence of actions over and over. Crouch, examine, make a note, move 3 steps clockwise, repeat. The fuel technician rolled his cart to the same aircraft, filled the same tank, returned to the same starting position, and began again. They were trapped in loops of eternal productivity, condemned to perform their duties until the end of time. Henderson was one of the first to understand. The supervisor continued, consulting his clipboard as if reading from a roster of the damned. Such dedication to the job. He's been with us for, it must be 15 years now. Time flies when you're part of the team. A worker in stained coveralls turned toward us, and I recognized the face from one of the handwritten notes we'd found earlier. His expression was serene, content, completely devoid of the fear and confusion his note had described. Whatever process had claimed him had been thorough and irreversible. Elena pulled at the hangar doors, but they might as well have been welded shut. Through the small windows, I could see that the gray light of dawn was strengthening. We had minutes, not hours, before sunrise would seal our fate. "The key is not to fight it," said a familiar voice behind us. We turned to see Vincent Blackwood himself, still wearing the suit he died in 30 years ago, though it showed no signs of age or decay. He looked exactly as he had in the old photographs from the case file, except for his eyes, which held the same terrible emptiness as his workers. "Mr. Blackwood," Elena said, "we're police officers. We have families, lives outside this place. We can't just disappear." Blackwood nodded with what might have been sympathy. "I said the same thing. Once upon a time. Had a wife, children, a house in Dallas with a swimming pool and a 2-car garage. But the airfield needed management, you see, someone to oversee the night operations, to ensure the morning shift maintains proper discipline." He straightened his tie with the same mechanical precision as a supervisor. "Sacrifice is sometimes required for the greater good." 4:47 a.m. The light coming through the windows was definitely brighter now, and I could hear something that made my heart race. The distant sound of an approaching engine. Not an aircraft, but a ground vehicle moving fast across the airfield's perimeter road. Elena heard it too, and hope flickered across her face. "Back up," she whispered. The supervisor frowned, consulting his clipboard again. "That's not on the schedule. No arrivals expected until the afternoon freight run." The engine sound grew louder, and I could see headlights sweeping across the hangar's windows. Then came the sound of brakes and car doors slamming, followed by voices shouting orders. "This is the Texas Rangers. We have the building surrounded." Detective Rivera's voice carried clearly through the hangar walls, and I had never been so happy to hear another human being in my life. But the workers around us seemed unperturbed by the development. They continued their repetitive tasks, as if the outside world was merely an irrelevant distraction. Blackwood sighed, the sound carrying decades of weariness. "Always some complication. Well, we'll simply have to expedite the process." He nodded to the supervisor, who reached into his pocket and withdrew what looked like a time clock punch card. But instead of a normal work card, this one bore names written in fading ink. Henderson, Morrison, Davies, and dozens of others. At the bottom, 2 fresh entries had been added in neat handwriting. Elena Vasquez and Jake Morrison. "Just a formality," the supervisor explained, moving toward what I now realized was an old-fashioned time clock mounted on the wall. "Once you punch in for your first shift, the transition becomes much easier. No more confusion. No more fear of the unknown, just purpose forever and ever." The hangar doors exploded inward as the Rangers used a battering ram to force entry. Tactical lights swept the interior, and I heard Rivera shouting, "Officers down. We need medical support." But even as help arrived, I could feel something changing in the air around us. The fluorescent lights were growing brighter, more intense, and the mechanical sounds of the workers' activities were speeding up, as if the entire operation was shifting into a higher gear. Elena grabbed my hand. "The windows," she shouted. "The rear windows." We ran toward the back of the hangar as the Rangers poured through the front entrance. Behind us, I could hear shouting and confusion as the tactical team encountered the impossible sight of a fully operational aircraft maintenance facility in a building that should have been empty for 30 years. The rear windows were high, but Elena boosted me up, and I managed to break the glass with my flashlight. As I hauled her through the opening, I caught one final glimpse of the hangar's interior. The Rangers were standing motionless among the workers, their tactical gear already fading, their expressions taking on the same serene emptiness that marked all of Blackwood's employees. We hit the ground outside running, sprinting across the tarmac toward the main gate as the sun crested the eastern horizon. Behind us, Hangar 5 began to fade, its bright lights dimming until only the familiar outline of an abandoned building remained. But I could still hear the sounds of activity inside, muffled now, but persistent, the eternal rhythm of a night shift that never truly ends. Elena got our patrol car started on the third try, and we drove through the main gate just as the first rays of sunlight touched the airfield's runway. In the rearview mirror, I watched Blackwood Airfield return to its familiar desolate state, all signs of nocturnal activity vanishing like dreams at dawn. But the dreams don't really end, do they? They just wait for the next sunset, the next group of unsuspecting visitors who might be tempted to ignore the rules spray-painted on a crumbling control tower wall. Elena and I submitted our reports, of course, but they were heavily edited by our supervisors. The official version spoke of trespassers and vandalism, of false alarms and equipment malfunctions. There was no mention of phantom aircraft or eternal work crews, no record of the Rangers who had come to our rescue, only to become part of the morning shift themselves. But sometimes on clear desert nights when the wind is still and the stars shine bright over Texas, I think about those rules. 5 simple warnings that meant the difference between going home to our families and joining Vincent Blackwood's timeless workforce. I think about Detective Rivera and his team, and I wonder if they punch in for their shifts at exactly 6 a.m., maintaining their eternal vigilance over an airfield that officially doesn't exist. The rules are still there, freshly painted each morning by hands that have long since forgotten what it means to be human. They wait patiently for the next curious visitors, the next skeptics who think themselves immune to the logic of the abandoned and forgotten. Rule 1. Never look up after midnight. Rule 2. If the hangar lights flicker, count to 10 before moving. Rule 3. Do not respond to your name being called from the runway. Rule 4. The fuel truck driver is not your friend. Rule 5. Leave before sunrise or become part of the morning shift. These rules keep you alive. Follow them. And whatever you do, never take the night shift at Blackwood Airfield. Some jobs last forever, whether you want them to or not.